In Douglas County, in southern Georgia, the Abdullah family home was surrounded by dense thickets and sprawling fruit trees that remained green even in the hot summer sun. The silence was piercing. Sometimes it was broken by the sound of cars on the next street, or the voices of children playing somewhere behind the house. But within the walls of this old house there was always peace, which was called family harmony, although for Zara Abdullah, the silence often turned into emptiness. She had long ago stopped feeling joy here and felt an unprecedented detachment from the people around her, although she hardly realized it. Zara, Jamal Abdullah's young wife, knew she was in luck. Jamal was respected in their community, a good Muslim and a caring son. In this home, where family tradition and Islamic customs came first, it was valued and respected that Jamal stayed true to tradition, tried to be the best example for his wife, and fulfilled all obligations to both family and community. But their marriage was not based on love. Increasingly, his restraint and taciturnity left Zara incomprehensible. Jamal seemed oblivious to her loneliness and her deep desire to find some warmth in communicating with him. Work travel had become his constant duty, and the days they spent together were no longer, in fact, days of their family togetherness. Even on his return, he remained immersed in his own affairs, planning something, writing or talking on the phone, and gradually Zara became accustomed to his brief replies and lack of attention to her life. When she was alone, she remembered her parents' house, large and also full of silence, but in a different, non-threatening way. She had grown up there, knowing that her life would be subject to the will of her father and later her husband, and was preparing herself to devote her whole soul to her family, to be a support to her husband. And she really wanted to support Jamal and be a reliable wife for him. But with each passing year, it became harder and harder for her to reconcile with the fact that no one wanted her feelings here. Sometimes she realized that she was really only the mistress in this house, cleaning and cooking for her husband, but that nothing in her life belonged to her. Her longing went unnoticed until one day, when Jamal was away again for a few days, Omar came into the house. Jamal's father was a man of extraordinary character. He always wore a long beard, black traditional clothes as if to show his devotion to religion, and his gaze radiated a calmness and confidence that created an aura of wisdom and reliability around him. In his youth, Omar was a man of passion and often became hot-tempered, but, as his friends said, the death of his wife changed him. Now Omar rarely left his abode and lived alone, only occasionally visiting his son and daughter-in-law. When he appeared on the doorstep, Zara was surprised but welcomed him for tea, not expecting that their simple conversation that day would be the beginning of such a long meeting. Their conversation was simple that day, and Omar, feeling like a master, began to ask her about the household, asking if she was doing well, if she needed anything. He seemed attentive, though she suspected he just wanted to maintain the tradition of socializing with his son's wife. They talked about the garden, about the flowers Omar himself had planted years ago. She said she continued to tend them, and in response she saw a look of gratitude in his eyes. It was unexpectedly gratifying to her. At last, someone noticed her efforts. Their conversations continued, once a week or less, and each time Omar opened up to her more and more. He shared his experiences with her, his reflections on life, how faith and prayer had helped him to keep going after the loss of his wife. His sincerity amazed her. He was not afraid to talk about his weaknesses and pain, and it was more than just a friendly conversation. Gradually, these meetings turned into an important event for her, which she looked forward to. Zara began to think of him in his absence, and her heart filled with a warmth that she herself realized was not entirely safe. At some point, she began to notice how she waited for him to come, and when he did, her mood changed. It was as if she became younger, warmer and more animated, her eyes glowing. And Omar seemed to sense this, but tried not to show his thoughts. He also began to find reasons to visit more often. They discussed the details of the garden, the decorations in the house, talked about her taste in cooking. Such simple and seemingly insignificant things that nevertheless remained for Zara the only living memory of her family, of her own life. As they sat over a cup of tea, the silence between them was filled with meaning. One evening, Omar came unexpectedly with a box of peaches and told her that he had picked them himself. He asked her to try some and said he would like her to take some of the fruit for herself. Zara served him tea, and they sat in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the night sounds from outside and hardly speaking to each other. But this silence, for the first time in a long time, did not seem empty to her. On the contrary, Zara felt surprisingly calm around him. They spoke little, but when she touched his hand to thank him for his concern, he held it lightly in his, and that fleeting touch seemed to revive in her a long-forgotten feeling of joy. It was the beginning of a secret affection which they both tried to conceal even from themselves. Their every gesture became more restrained, but there was a certain spark in their glances. They both tried not to look at each other for longer than politeness would allow, but each time it was less and less successful. Zara went on with her life, looking forward to each visit as if it were the most important event of her daily life. And Omar found more and more reasons to be there. One day he said to her, "You know, Zara, faith is not only about rituals, but also about understanding and caring for each other." In that moment she realized that his words resonated with her soul, and that he saw her not just as his son's wife, but as a person with whom he was interested. She could have pushed the feeling away, but she didn't want to. It was the first time in years that someone had seen her, noticed her, and truly understood her. The warm hope that someone might feel love for her settled back into the house. And so, day by day, their latent affection grew stronger, growing into their everyday life like the peach trees Omar had told her so movingly about. In Abdullayev's house they were preparing for a big event, a family holiday, which had become a tradition and gathered all family and friends together. This time there were several reasons for celebration. Jamal received another promotion at work, and the anniversary of his wedding with Zara was approaching. The family was preparing for the holiday with all their hearts, and Zara, sparing no effort, strived to make this day special. She, from early morning, was engaged in the preparation of treats, decorating the house, trying to put in these preparations a piece of warmth, which she herself sometimes lacked. The house was filled with the aromas of fresh spices and fried dishes. The guests were to arrive by noon, and Zara worked hard in the kitchen, trying to get everything done before the first guests arrived. Omar arrived a little earlier, knowing that she would be busy, and without waiting for an invitation, went straight into the kitchen to offer help. When Zara saw him, she was confused. Omar rarely stayed in her sight for so long, especially on such important days, when even a brief glance could reveal their secret sympathy. Yet they both felt that today's event gave them a special reason to spend time together. "Let me help you with the cooking," Omar offered, holding out his hands to the bowl of spices she held. Zara hesitated a moment before agreeing, but the look on Omar's calm face and his good-natured tone reassured her. Together they set about the cooking, concentrating on cutting vegetables, mixing spices, and preparing the food for serving. Working in the kitchen, usually a chore, seemed special to her this time. The fleeting touches, the brief glances when their hands touched over the same dish, gave her a sweet thrill. From time to time, she caught herself thinking that it was as if they were dancing, moving harmoniously, barely speaking but understanding each other without words. When Omar leaned over the dish to taste it, Zara saw his hands barely touch her elbow. There wasn't an ounce of intent in the gesture, and yet it caused her confusion. She looked away, feeling her heart beat faster, and pretended to be preoccupied with something else. But her mind was still focused on his touch, and the sense of peace she felt around him was mixed with forbidden joy. The festivities had begun. One by one, the guests arrived at the house, and the hall gradually filled with laughter and voices. Conversations seemed to be about everything, from the latest news to the children's successes and general plans for the future. Omar and Zara were among the guests, acting as gracious hosts, and all their intimacy was instantly hidden under the mask of customary politeness. Neither of them, however, could forget the morning moments in the kitchen, brief touches, glances that made them feel warm. In the evening, when some of the guests had begun to leave, only the closest ones remained in the house. Jamal went out to the backyard to talk to his buddies, and Zara, feeling the fatigue starting to take its toll, decided to sit in the kitchen for a while and relax. She walked over to the sink to get a drink of water and suddenly heard a quiet rustle behind her. Omar entered the kitchen, closing the door behind him. Their gazes met in the semi-darkness, and a tense silence enveloped them like a dense cloud. "Long day, isn't it?" Omar asked, sitting down at the table and pouring himself some tea. "Yes, but it went well," Zara replied, trying not to look him in the eye. It was just the two of them again, and it increased their inner tension. Omar slowly rose from his chair and came closer, standing very close to her, barely touching her shoulder. A look of understanding lingered softly on her face. "You know," he began, "sometimes I think there is too much silence in this house." His words touched something in her soul. She looked up, feeling something shiver inside. This simple phrase was unexpectedly close to her thoughts, and she felt that she was not alone in her worries. In that silent moment, standing beside him in the dim light of the kitchen, Zara felt inexpressibly relieved. She didn't need to pretend or explain her feelings. Omar seemed to already know everything she could say. "Omar," she began, hesitant to say more, but he understood. He took her hand, holding it in his, and silence enveloped them again, this time binding them more tightly than any words could. The gesture was bolder than any of their past encounters. They both knew they had already crossed the line, but they couldn't bring themselves to break the bond that had imperceptibly but decisively formed between them. Their touches were still light, as if every movement had been thought out, but nevertheless every gesture said more than long explanations. After a while, they let go of each other, as if realizing that further steps might take them too far. With a heavy heart, Omar quietly left the kitchen, leaving Zara alone with her thoughts. She stood at the sink, listening to the receding footsteps, and for the first time in a long time, she felt alive, full of hope and longing at the same time. Her heart was full of feelings she could not express. She was afraid of ruining her life, and at the same time longed for this new light that Omar had given her. Late in the evening, when the guests had gone and the house had fallen back into its usual silence, Zara sat in her bedroom, thinking about her inner turmoil. Her thoughts were preoccupied with what might happen if she dared to tell someone how she felt, but every word seemed too dangerous. Still, that evening left her with a sense of inevitability. She realized that her life would never be the same again. At night, when Jamal was already asleep, she felt a heaviness on her soul that robbed her of sleep. Zara went to the bathroom and took the vial of sleeping pills she occasionally resorted to at times like this. But as she looked at it, she suddenly realized that she no longer wanted to continue the habit. She experienced a strange feeling of foreboding and uneasiness. Later, looking at her reflection in the mirror, she noticed that something new was happening to her body. The next day, feeling slightly sick, Zara went to the hospital, and the doctor confirmed her suspicions. She was pregnant. When she returned home, she sat alone for a while, pondering the unexpected news. The news brought both joy and fear. Her life was making sense again, and although the child was to be her future, her feelings for Omar were still there. She decided to stop taking the sleeping pills immediately, feeling that she had more than just herself to take care of. The almost week-long silence between Zaroya and Omar only added to their confusion. They tried to avoid each other. Omar went about his daily business, while Zaroya withdrew into the care of the house, hardly realizing how her thoughts kept returning to both of them. Both knew it would be impossible to avoid seeing each other now. After the family holiday, which had become more than just an event for them, every day alone became a torment. They were drawn to each other like lovers left at a distance, but neither dared to say anything about it. One evening, Omar dared to write. Short lines, barely visible script on a piece of paper. He put the note under the door of their house, where only Zara could find it. It asked her to meet him in a place where no one could see them, an old pavilion surrounded by trees, just outside the boundaries of their small town, where his father had once made his first purchases, and where his family seemed to have completely forgotten about the place after his grandmother died. When Zara found the note, her heart fluttered. She didn't think about why her soul was drawn to this man, knowing only one thing: their meeting would be an inevitability, and she herself longed for it as something to save her. The next day, early in the morning, while the world was still awake, Zara went outside. She made her way to the meeting place along a path that looped through green shrubs and old trees. Mist drifted across the ground, giving the place an air of mystery. When she reached the pavilion, Omar was already there, standing with his head bowed as if praying. She approached him, and as their gazes met, all the restraint that had been building up in their souls evaporated with a click. "I'm sorry," Zara whispered, unable to meet his gaze. "No, I'm the one who should apologize," Omar replied, gently lifting her chin so that their eyes met. "I should have been stronger. I knew that this kind of feeling would only lead to pain." They stood side by side, and the world disappeared around them. Only the wind rustled in the branches, and the silence that filled everything around them seemed to free them from their worries. Omar looked at her with a warmth she hadn't felt in so long, and his soft, barely visible wrinkles around his eyes gave his face the depth and kindness that so clung to her. She realized that these feelings, as dangerous as they were her salvation. "I tried to suppress the feeling," Zara admitted carefully, as if afraid to speak too loudly lest she ruin the fragile moment. "So did I," he replied, touching her hand gently, and there was no haste in the gesture, just a tenderness he didn't seem to have allowed himself in years. They talked for a long time, sitting on a bench at the back of a pavilion surrounded by woods. They talked about everything that had long troubled each of them, about their lives, their fears, and their future. In this secluded corner of the world, away from a society that would not forgive them for such a betrayal, they opened up to each other in a way they had never been able to before. Each of them knew that their feelings were forbidden, that they were playing with fire. But despite all the arguments of reason, they could not give up this meeting, these revelations. Omar took her hand, and they, feeling the world around them dissolve, spent the whole day in the pavilion. For them, these hours became precious, like a stopped time that granted them moments detached from reality. As the day drew to a close, they said their goodbyes, unable to resolve to do anything more. Both knew that it was not the end, that the meeting had left an indelible mark on their hearts. The next day, when Jamal returned home, he noticed that Zara looked different. Her face glowed with a soft light that he hadn't seen in a long time. She was immersed in her thoughts, and her smile was something more than a courtesy. Jamal, though he was not observant in such matters, felt a slight suspicion. Something in her demeanor alerted him, subtle but unsettling. As he looked at her more closely, he realized that she had someone who gave her something he could not. His heart filled with anger and resentment. It infuriated him to think that someone could fiddle with something that belonged to him. That evening, Jamal returned home late. He noticed that Zara, usually cautious and calm, seemed to be trying to avoid his gaze. She was silent, and after dropping a brief explanation, she headed for the bathroom. Jamal was left alone in the bedroom, feeling a strange uneasiness spill around him. He slowly looked around her table, his gaze lingering on the vial of sleeping pills, and the tension in his eyes. Jamal sat on the edge of the bed and slowly ran his hand over the covers, trying to figure out what was different about this house and why he felt so uncomfortable. The feeling was becoming unbearable for him. He was used to his role as head of the family, used to having the last word. But now, looking around him, he felt that the life he had been building was beginning to fall apart. The next morning, the house was awakened by strange, thudding sounds. Zara was awakened by the noise of voices coming from downstairs. She hurried to the first floor, still drowsy. In the living room, surrounded by relatives, lay Omar. His motionless body was frozen as if in a dream, but his face was remarkably calm, as if he had long since made peace with his passing. Jamal stood nearby, pale, with a fixed expression, and seemed oblivious to the people around him or the sounds. "Dad." His voice came out hoarse, barely audible, and as if awake, he knelt beside Omar's body, still silent. The Abdullah family home was shrouded in silence when the police arrived. The small Georgia town was rarely the scene of high-profile investigations, and the death of a respected senior family member had caused widespread publicity. The family doctor, after examining Omar and finding no obvious signs of heart attack or other natural causes of death, felt it necessary to report the case to the police. A few hours later, detectives arrived on the scene. Young but experienced Jessica Wilson and her partner, Juan Rodriguez, both were not local to the area, and their outside perspective was devoid of the bias that so often plagues locals. Detectives inspected the house and suggested the family launch an investigation to rule out the possibility of a violent death. The relatives were stunned, though they did not dare to argue. It was customary to bow their heads respectfully and allow the police to investigate. Jamal seemed to be in a state of shock. He tried not to draw attention to himself, remained silent, avoided direct stares. Zara kept close to him, her face tense, and every glance she cast at her husband seemed to indicate some inner fear. The detectives noticed her tension. For several hours, Jessica and Juan had been interviewing family members. Jessica, who was watching each of their reactions closely, noticed that Jamal's face turned slightly pale at the mention of Omar's medication. Zara, who was standing next to him, visibly tensed as well. Some shadow seemed to flicker in their eyes, but both quickly returned to outward calm. Juan took note of this detail, and he and his partner decided to take a few vials of the medications that Omar took regularly. It also seemed strange to the pathologist that Omar's face remained calm and even peaceful, despite his age and illnesses. This did not fit the classic symptoms of death from natural causes. When he analyzed the contents of the vials, his hunch was confirmed. One of them contained traces of a poisonous substance, barely noticeable, but strong enough to cause slow and agonizing poisoning. Upon discovering the poison in Omar's medication, he immediately notified the detectives, and they returned to the Abdullah family home to continue their investigation. Jessica decided to examine the other family members' medications as well to eliminate any possibility of error. Zara was home alone when the detectives returned to her house and, sensing the tension building, asked, "Is it true that you found something?" Her voice trembled slightly, but she tried to remain calm. Jessica looked at her carefully but didn't reveal all the details, just nodded. "We're checking all the possibilities," she said, glancing casually at the sleeping pills on the nightstand next to the bed. "We need to look at all the medications that were taken in the house." Zara didn't object and allowed the detectives to look through her room. Jessica took a moment to pick up a vial of sleeping pills, casually glancing at it. Her intuition told her that there was something lurking in the house that defied logical explanation. When the contents of the sleeping pills were analyzed, the results shocked her. Traces of the same poison were found in this vial. Urgent questions arose. Who could have put poison in the drugs? Why Omar's drugs and Zara's sleeping pills? What was the motive? The detectives returned to the house where Jamal, who had just returned from work, caught them. He met them with an impenetrable face, trying to remain apparently calm, but as soon as he noticed the vial of sleeping pills in Jessica's hands, his face contorted slightly. The detectives caught the instant change, and Jessica continued her questioning, pretending not to notice his reaction. "Jamal, do you have any idea who might have wanted to hurt your father or your wife?" Jessica stared into his face, trying to see even a hint of a reaction. Jamal almost flinched, but quickly pulled himself together. He pretended to consider the question and answered as discreetly as he could. "No. We always had a strong family. My father helped everyone, and no one would do anything to hurt him." His voice trembled slightly. "Do you suspect that someone in the family might have had a motive?" Juan continued with even more urgency, glancing at Zara, who, despite his efforts, looked frightened and confused. "Motive?" Jamal, grinning, looked away again. "It's strange. Our families are close, and I don't know anyone who would wish." He hesitated, but quickly added, "Evil." Jessica continued to watch Jamal and Zara. There was something odd about their behavior. Jamal seemed to want to end the conversation as quickly as possible, and Zara, on the contrary, looked worried, as if she were trying to be honest, but something was holding her back. They seemed distant from each other, and Jessica, discussing their suspicions with Juan, concluded that something was wrong. The next day, Jessica and Juan came to the house again and invited the whole family in for a more in-depth interrogation. Zara tensed but remained silent. Jamal, as before, tried to keep his cool. The detectives started with the most general questions, but soon began to move on to more specific ones, and Jamal looked increasingly wary. "Zara, Jessica spoke softly, turning to her. "Tell me, how long have you been taking sleeping pills?" Zara was a little confused, but then, under the eyes of the detectives, she answered, "A few months, but I stopped taking them. I recently found out I was pregnant and I don't take sleeping pills anymore," she said quietly but firmly. Jamal pressed his lips together, barely perceptibly tense. It didn't escape the detective's eyes, and Juan looked at him carefully. "Congratulations," he nodded curtly. "But the sleeping pills were still on your bedside table, and unfortunately we found a dangerous substance in them." Zara, hearing this, looked sharply at the vial. Horror flashed in her eyes, and Jessica noticed her hands trembling. "It's impossible. Someone," she tried to say, but the words stuck in her throat. Jamal continued to stand by her side, never once meeting her gaze. Jessica and Juan scrutinized his expression and couldn't shake the thought that he was not just a grieving widower, but a man trying to hide something. Jessica and Juan, absorbed in the intricacies of the investigation, returned to the Abdullah family the next day. They conferred at length, discussing the strange behavioral details they'd noticed in Jamal and Zara. Restrained excitement, awkward glances, as if there was more lurking between them than their father's grief and his wife's pregnancy. Their suspicions grew stronger as the detectives examined the evidence they had found and scrutinized the pathologist's office records. That evening, they decided to review the witness statements and went to one of Omar's oldest acquaintances to learn more about the family. An old man named Saeed, whose family lived next door to Abdullah, told detectives how he had often spotted Omar and Zara together in recent months, especially during Jamal's absence. The detectives pretended it was just a routine interrogation, but Saeed, after a bit of silence, couldn't resist making further comments. "You know, Omar was a serious man, but..." The old man paused, as if daring to say aloud the suspicion that depressed him. "I began to notice that they were often alone together." These words proved to be the final touch that the detectives had been missing. The uneasy feeling associated with Jamal's actions was now taking shape. With that information, they returned to the pathologist, asking for another look at Omar and Zara's medication samples. The reanalysis revealed traces of the poisonous substance not only in Omar's medication capsules, but also in the vial of sleeping pills. This was already enough for a serious interrogation. Jamal was summoned to the police station, also inviting Zara for formal questioning. Entering the office, Jessica felt the tension in the air. Jamal barely glanced at Zara, avoiding any eye contact. Zara was subdued. Her face looked weary, and her gaze wandered, as if she didn't know how long she could hold on. "Jamal," Jessica began, "we've scrutinized the evidence and would like to ask you some questions about what went on in the family shortly before your father's death." Jamal nodded demurely, trying to appear calm, but his fingers trembled slightly. "Were you aware of your father and your wife's personal relationship?" Jessica asked bluntly, watching his reaction. Jamal froze, and then his face contorted faintly. He quickly regained his composure, but the coldness in his gaze told the detectives all they needed to know. "What are you talking about?" His voice sounded strained. They were just socializing. Her father was her mentor. That was normal. Jessica nodded as if agreeing, but didn't stop watching his face. "We also found out that Zara recently found out she was pregnant," Juan added. "Maybe you knew about it before she told you?" Jamal tensed, and his face showed an internal struggle. He raised his eyes to Zara, and for the first time in all the time he'd been trying to hide his emotions, his face softened. For a moment, that quickly disappeared. "I found out by accident," he finally squeezed out, as if he had a hard time admitting it. "But what do you mean by that?" Jessica and Juan looked at each other meaningfully. They already knew what was behind his words. "There was poison in the vials of Zara's sleeping pills and in Omar's medication," Jessica said, watching his expression carefully. "It means that someone deliberately wanted both your father and your wife dead." Jamal didn't answer right away. His face showed a look of fear mixed with uncertainty, and then, as if to dispel that fear, his eyes darkened. "This is crazy," he whispered, but his voice sounded muffled, as if he didn't believe himself. "Maybe," Jessica agreed. But now we have enough evidence to believe that the poison wasn't planted by accident. And if you knew that Zara was pregnant and that Omar was paying attention to her, that sounds like motive. Jamal was silent, his lips pressed into a thin line, but he no longer looked surprised. The detective sensed that he might be ready to confess, but his pride prevented him from doing so. "Jamal," Juan's voice sounded stern, "we know you stayed home that evening and were near Omar and Zara's medication. We were able to detect traces of poison on the vial you had in your belongings. Do you have an explanation?" Jamal shuddered. His face had lost its usual calm, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked at Zara, but met her gaze with a look of bewilderment and confusion. "They betrayed me," he blurted out, as if this confession had been building up inside him and needed to come out. I knew that Omar and her, that there was something between them, and I couldn't stand it." He clenched his fists, staring in front of him, his eyes blazing with an anger he could no longer control now. "I was trying to get back what was mine." His voice shook, and he continued in a whisper, as if he were saying it to himself. "Omar had ruined my life, my family." Jessica nodded softly, realizing that now they knew the truth. Jamal's words had become a confession, and his motive was clearer than ever. The moment he felt his world threatened, his pride took over his reason. "Do you realize what this means?" Jessica looked at him sorrowfully, realizing that this was a man who had been pushed by feelings of jealousy and despair into an irreversible act. Jamal nodded, looking away. "Yes, I understand." His voice was full of bitterness. "But Zara, it wasn't her fault." With those words, he raised his eyes to his wife, and there was a pleading look in his gaze, as if he wanted her to understand him, even now, after everything that had happened. When the detectives took Jamal away, Zara was left alone in the house. Her sadness was unspeakable. The feelings for Omar that had bound them together were ruined, leaving only pain and disappointment for her. She realized that her search for warmth and understanding had caused a terrible tragedy, and now she had to carry the burden further. Several months had passed since the day Jamal was taken away from home in a police car. The time dragged on slowly, as if every minute was soaked with pain and loss. The Abdullah family home, which used to be full of familiar sounds and traditions, now resembled an empty shell, where every echo was like a reminder of the past. Zara was left alone. Neighbors and relatives, once caring and sympathetic, now shunned her, afraid to even speak of what had happened. She knew that their eyes followed her from the windows, that their whispers sounded behind her back every time she stepped outside the door. She became a stranger in her own community, but she accepted her fate as if she knew she deserved it. Her pregnancy was progressing, and now she could feel the life inside her growing stronger every day. This life, such a gentle and pure gift, had become her last bond, her only comfort. At night she would sit at the window, looking up at the stars, as if searching them for answers to the questions that plagued her. She didn't know whether her child would be a symbol of a broken past or a new hope. Her heart was filled with feelings mixed with love, guilt, and longing. One such night she wrote a letter to Jamal, never sent, kept under her pillow. In it, she wrote everything that was in her soul, about regret, about how sorry she was that her search for warmth and understanding had turned into a destructive feeling that turned into a tragedy for everyone. But she also wrote that in this child she would find the strength to live on, that she would cherish this life despite all the difficulties, and dedicate it to the memory of the one she had lost. At night she dreamed of Omar, his calm face, the soft gaze she had last seen. His image reminded her that love doesn't always bring joy, but it always leaves a mark on the soul. With each passing day, Zara realized more deeply that her encounter with him was not only a loss, but an important lesson. Now that she was alone, there was only a future of uncertainty in front of her.